Harry's
Welcome.
Going
Go ahead, Sal.
Hang on 1 second for everyone to come in, Hayim, and then I'll play the video.
Starting with the video, okay.
Go.
Welcome, everybody, to the second webinar in the PsyTech webinar series. This evening's panel discussion is called Putting Your Money Where Your Mind Is, the Psychedelics Investment Landscape. My name is Hayim Raclaw. I'm CEO of PsyTech, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this conversation from my home in Mazkeret Batya, Israel. We believe it's an important conversation because the private sector, fueled by investment capital, can accelerate research, innovation, and enable much greater access for people to psychedelics. As always, the PsyTech webinars are always free, always compelling. We're driven by our mission to promote good research, innovation, and education. Thank you for joining the conversation, and stay tuned for more, including the PsyTech Virtual Summit, which will be happening later this month. You can look for the registration link in the chat sidebar or the Zoom platform that we're using tonight. Notes for the audience, please use the chat function for comments and questions, and enjoy. There will also be polling throughout, so please don't misinterpret the pop-ups you see from us, and your feedback via the polls is always much appreciated. I also have to give a special shout out tonight to Christian Angermeyer for rounding out $10,000 of donation to MAPS, which was an initiative that was launched at our previous webinar. MAPS does fantastic work, and there will be more opportunities to donate to them and other good organizations operating in the psychedelic space. Without anything further, I'd like to jump right in with introductions to the panel that we have with us tonight, or today in North America, and this morning in Hawaii. First, Bruce Linton, founder and former chairman, CEO, and co-CEO of Canopy Growth Corporation of Ontario. Canopy Growth was the first cannabis company listed on a major stock exchange and to be included in a major stock index. Bruce led Canopy from a TSX V-listed startup company with an $80 million market cap to a NICE and TSX listed company, which included more than 30 M&A activities. Bruce's experience as a founder, CEO, board member, chairman, executive advisor with 9 different companies today, including being an active investor with Martello, Slang, and with MindMed and Psychedelics. Bruce has a long and successful record from all sides of the deal-making table to build companies. That's why we're very pleased to have him join us tonight. He's also sat on the board of governors at Carleton University and with Canada Youth Worldwide, amongst other good works. Bruce joins us from Ontario, Canada. With us also is Dr. Jayashree J. Mitra. She's a practicing attorney with Zuber Law. That's a top firm in the United States with breadth and depth in emerging markets like cannabis, and Zuber is entering psychedelics under Jay's lead. Jay has deep experience with IP, M&A, due diligence, and investment deal structuring. Prior to law, very relevantly, Jay conducted research in neuropharmacology, and she's earned degrees from Yale, Northwestern, and the All India Institute of Science. In addition, as if she weren't busy enough, she does pro bono work on criminal appeals and the death penalty in the state of New York. She's joining us from New York City. And Alex Speiser is the COO of Orthoganol Thinker, a multidimensional wellness platform dedicated to individual and collective well-being via psychoactive compounds. Orthogonal has just raised $6 million for further execution of its psychedelics business plans. Speiser is an early stage startup investor with a track record of successful ventures and strategic roles, including VP of Business Development. He also just moved from New York to Hawaii, so Alex is joining us from a virtual paradise today. I'm going to jump right in with the questions this evening. And the first one is really around why you're here, why you're with us. So I'd like to start with you, Bruce. As an investor, what attracted you to psychedelics and what are the kinds of opportunities you're looking for today?
Not terribly dissimilar in some ways to what attracted me to creating Tweed then Canopy in 2012-13. It was like really stupid, multi-generational stupid public policy had existed. And they continued it like the family business of stupid on public policy. And then finally there was a generation born that said, why do we hate cannabinoids? Why do we like good guys or dislike good guys and really like funding illegal supply chains to billions and billions and billions of dollars? Why don't we quit doing that and begin regulating, monetizing, and educating? And so when you see a transformational window based on public policy and public perception, if there's a massive arbitrage between reality and the stupidity of the prior public policy, you should invest. And so when I was fired from Canopy, I'd already been pretty active around the space. You know, I'd met with George before it was called Compass. I'd been involved with the Beckley Foundation in terms of the transaction we did to bring some of their stuff over. And so I wanted to see this because I thought it was Exhibit A in unbelievably stupid public policy that prohibited access to things that might actually have a positive neurological effect and on our individual perception of how reality is. And so that arb is gigantic and you should always move on them. And so that's probably sounds either boring, selfish, or nerdy, but the reality is I have no competency in how to invent the solution. But if you see that kind of gap and no others do, you should be an investor, at least in a cheering section at minimum.
I think both of those things are much needed, and the observation of the dynamics of generational bad policy is interesting. Alex, you're, though you obviously have a background as an investor, you're on the other side of the equation of raising capital right now in this space. What kinds of investors are you seeking and what attracted you to psychedelics?
So when we start looking at the investment landscape and we start thinking about where have people in our space been able to successfully raise capital, the answer is really twofold. The first is from the crowd, from regular people that just like me, you know, they wish for this to come to life. They know how game-changing psychedelic medicine can be. And they're frankly putting their money where their mouth is. At Orthoganol, our first raise was a WeFunder raise in February of 2019. And similar crowd raises are also illustrated by companies like MindMed's. MindMed's IPO was effectively a fancier, schmancier IPO model raise from the crowd. And then the second piece is really family offices. If you look at a company like Compass, Peter Thiel and Christian Angermeyer are anchoring Compass, and their whole network is really family offices. And the same goes for us. There isn't a single endowment, pension fund, institution in the mix. The truth is that the VCs that we've worked with are no different. It's all family offices there. And so we're focusing on regular people and family offices, and any time we really, at this point, spend outside of those two avenues is not serving us. That's how it is today. The world obviously may change, but I think in general, if you had to classify who these investors are, they're disruptors. They believe in disrupting systems like Bruce was just talking about. And they're looking for cutting edge innovations, and psychedelic medicine is obviously one of those.
Let me ask one more question before I turn the same question to Jay. So Alex, if you were to describe the archetypal investor in Orthogonal, does it bend towards people who see the opportunity in the market purely in financial terms, or do you find that investors at this early stage are enthusiastic, that they want to do both well and good at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. It's not a mutually exclusive situation. I think in general, our investors are people who have the freedom to pursue their passions, their vision, and they're pursuing investments that, that at the same time want to make the world a better place. Our main investor has holdings like 3D printing rockets, And they couldn't be more excited about psychedelics. They couldn't be more excited about the game-changing data that's coming out of places like Hopkins. And they know once it's applied at a broad scale and things like mindfulness or more broadly achieved, it's just going to be so fundamentally game-changing. And because of that, I think they see a very lucrative investment possibility, but they also see a common good that can be achieved.
That's certainly what's brought me and a lot of the people in PsyTech to this space. It's an opportunity to do well and good at the same time.
Yeah.
Jay, I want to turn the same question to you. What brought you to psychedelics? And you, being counsel, have represented both sides of this equation. So please, what are the most critical legal issues and what brought you to psychedelics?
I would say I came to psychedelics, I would say psychoactive products, long before I was a lawyer. I started life as a neuroscientist and I never thought I would be a lawyer. I was very happy to study the brain because I think it's one of the most fascinating organs in the human body. And I used to study cocaine. Well, cocaine was just incidental. The real issue was how did the brain interact with compounds that directly affected the various networks, because the brain is a very complex network and you touch one component and the whole network changes. So that's what really attracted me. I became a lawyer entirely by accident. I got hit by a car and I needed another job. That was literally it. But once I became a lawyer, I started litigating drugs that for some reason were always affecting the central nervous system. Pain, depression. So for some reason or the other, I've always been involved with pharmaceutical compounds that have had a relationship with the central nervous system. What I will say is, I see this as not so much as a psychedelic specific issue, but more as this is a therapeutic area that is underserved. And this is a class of compounds that can bring incredible value. And the question I'm asking is, what can we do to make it happen? And the question I'm asking is, what are the challenges? What are the barriers that we need to overcome? And what is the value that we can give both to the community and to the investors? So rather than focusing on whether public policy is foolish or public policy is wrong, I'm a scientist. I deconstruct the problem. These are the problems and these are the solutions. And what can I do to make it happen? And from a lawyer's perspective, what are the benchmarks that I look for? I look for good IP. I look for a long-term vision where the various components are all married together. Is your IP and your regulatory pathway, your distribution network, your infrastructural framework, are all these married together in a way that we know works in the pharmaceutical framework? And can we make that happen in a manner that we can sell to the existing regulatory and other necessary authorities to get their buy-in to bring this to the marketplace?
Hey, Jay, please take it the right way, but what was running through my head the whole time you were speaking is, wow, that must have been quite the car accident to go from a neuroscientist. It must have really diminished your IQ and taken away your ethical perspective that you became a lawyer. No, I was just joking.
Yeah. It was quite a remarkable incident, but you know what? These things happen, and we just learn to live with it.
Well, hopefully,
that's not how all lawyers are made. Jay, actually, you pivoted into the next question I wanted to ask all of you. So why don't we start with you? What are the kinds of opportunities you're seeing for investment in psychedelics in these early days? In other words, where is the valuable IP, and what are the most promising business models?
I'm happy to take that.
Go ahead.
Sure. So look, there are a handful of serious companies that are creating value and solving real problems in the space at this point. If you could segment it, I would say the categories really are biotech, clinical, like clinics, and telemedicine. When I look at biotech opportunities, I mean, within Orthoganol, we're obviously a holding company. We're primarily focused on wellness, and the crown jewel of Orthoganol is our psychedelic science company, EI. And what I'm looking for when I'm assessing the psychedelic landscape are formulations and IP that stand a chance to really achieve a dramatic change at a broad scale. And these are not shots in the dark. These are compounds with a proven clinical background that can, lead the dramatic change that we want to see. In terms of the other segments, there's the clinical side, which really deals with the delivery side of things. If we're talking about biotech, we're obviously talking about the drug innovation side of things. And the clinical model that we're seeing is with companies like Field Trip Ventures, where they're establishing clinics and customers can go there and get certain treatments. And then the last category that I think is really exciting is telemedicine, in which you're incorporating functions like biosensors and using platforms like Zoom and integrating therapies from that model. At EI, we're most focused on the drug innovation side. We have a number of compounds that could go to market tomorrow and dramatically lead to the things that we want to see. And so frankly, when I'm looking at biotech-oriented companies, I want to see at this point companies that can provide access and affordability tomorrow because of how big of the changes that we want to see are.
I see. What do you see as the fastest of those three pathways you described for return on investment?
So it depends on how you measure return on investment and when. I mean, if you look at MindMed, their return on investment has been absolutely exceptional. There's been an IPO and a lot of investors have exited. At this point, when it comes to Orthoganol, we're in control of our cap table, and that relates to a lot of the accountability initiatives that we're putting forward. But in terms of ROI, I think, look, as an investor, you have to think about your exit strategy, how soon you want to exit. If it's tomorrow, then you're going to have to look at companies that are driving towards IPO. If you're more interested in growth stage companies that are going to provide exits within 5 to 7 years, I would definitely say more of a biotech play.
Thank you. Bruce, same question.
Yeah,
where do you see the valuable IP and the business models today?
Well, and I should disclose, so I'm invested in MindMed, and I did that in July. It was July when it was deemed still a very bad idea. And I invested in a company in Denmark called Octarine. And I'm invested in a company called Red Light Holland. And they're kind of—
Is that what they do?
Truffle.
To
Working on a truffle strategy, bring to market. So each of those has a very different horizon and positioning, right? One is working, Red Light Holland's looking at the current possible, I'll call it, platforms that enable the legal introduction of these. Octarine is very active in how do they actually create, I'll call it, you could think of rare cannabinoids, but you could also think about psilocybin or a variety of other things, but how do they bring it to scale in a yeast in an environment where they actually have had a history of how do they bring stevia to market in scale, and how do they make it water soluble? So they probably would compete with a couple of the more known entities, but I think their tech might be better. And MindMed is like a platform. And so in each of them, I think you have to have a much longer, if you want to write one check in a platform company, that's not a good idea unless you're there first. As these things build up, you should be able to follow a few times. Same with Octarine. Something like Red Light, they should be, with short order, cash flow generating. So the thing I actually look for in it is that people tell as much as I believe it to be the facts and truth. And what I mean by that is, this is not a marijuana investment. It doesn't have the exact same direct drive displacing the illicit market, and it's not going to necessarily become a recreational product, and it's not going to, that story is not the same story. I also think that the time horizon can be very different, right? Like when you think about a MindMed, yes, you can trade in and trade out, but really the goals they have should be something you contemplate over 18 to 36 months and begin measuring then how you're doing against your 3 and 5 and 6 year goals. And so these things do have some frameworks that are often, I found a lot of the companies, and I get a lot of decks, they disclose how quick you can get rich, which is usually a very quick way to not get rich. And so I would be, I like the fact that Alex, you controlled your cap table. I think it's important to actually be able to drive that, but those are 3 that I like. I'm always looking for more. And so I'll give my email at the end. But I also like to see strong scientists really in the core of the mix.
So investing in people as much as concept. You raised an interesting point, and you're the best positioned person to answer it, Bruce. A lot of the headlines try and tie cannabis markets and psychedelics markets together because they both suffered the undue vilification of the war on drugs. But the differences are substantial. You touched on a few. How would you characterize the similarities and differences for investors, for people watching the private sector between psychedelics and cannabis?
Well, just pick any market. So Canada's an easy one. It's been sort of durable for a bit of time. The cannabis trade, bank estimates, not government estimates, are that it's somewhere between 7 billion and 10 billion Canadian. So call it $5 to $7.5 billion. So really the business proposition in the Canadian market is that we hope to increasingly substitute illegally purchased products, which are typically produced without people paying benefits to their employees and taxes in a full way, et cetera, and who knows what's in them. We hope to, over time, essentially just have a swap, buy legal rather than illegal, so that we can do that, monetize and educate step that the government does. So that was a pretty straightforward investment thesis. And the only question people should have is, will the country stick with it? And will that happen? Then over time, will the parties which are creating the legal trade invest thoughtfully in creating intellectual property and really milligram-driven dosages so that they can actually have the answer to how much, what format, when, and what should I expect? And so that was a pretty easy, if you just back up from it, it's not a really hard investment to accept. That does not exist. I don't see anything in Canada where they're saying, well, let's bring psilocybin to the fore, and on a medical basis, let's just swap it out. There may be a charter challenge that does that. So I think that the economic model is a little bit different, where the first one with cannabis is just quit letting the illegal market have it and get it legally. In all this, and I hate the word psychedelics, but we'll use it. In that space, what it is you actually have to do the work to prove the efficacy in order to then swap out pharmaceutical. And that is a different line of work, which is why you need to have a bit more durability in your investor pattern.
A question came in from the audience that I think is pertinent now. How do you all think about downstream financing risk for early stage investments in this space? I guess another way to put that would be, what are the milestones you look at that are good markers that the company's on the right track? By definition, all these companies are early stage. There's regulatory barriers aplenty. The market dynamics are very different than simply displacing dragging a black market into the light. What do you look for in these early stage companies?
Jay, should we let you you've got a nice corner on my screen. Should we let you give a kick at it?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at an early stage, so I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of somebody who's worked in the pharmaceutical industry and who has seen a drug go from a bench to what I call the killing fields of antitrust litigation. It's going to take you 10 years to develop a drug. You bring it to the market, you enjoy market domination for a while, and then the antitrust lawyers come after you. And the question is, how do you maximize your return on it? You want to start out with a good patent portfolio that's going to give you maximum protection around your product for as long as you can. So one of the first things I'm looking for is how well has that patent ticket been built? And when I say a patent ticket, some drugs have like 100 patents around them. It's not because all the patents are good, but they've been built because each patent is expensive to knock out. So one thing I'm looking at is how well has that infrastructure been built? Then I'm looking at questions like how well has the pipeline, the supply chain been built? Because one thing to remember about this class of products, these drugs are not easy to make. Unlike, say, you take, let's say, a random common product in the marketplace, say Lipitor. It's a small molecule, you can easily make it, you can easily put it in the marketplace. In terms of supply chain, it doesn't create a lot of barriers to putting it in the marketplace. You try to create a Schedule 1 drug, and put it in the marketplace, there are a lot of infrastructural problems. Where you build your factories, how you're going to make the molecule, where the FDA and the DEA will demand the inspections take place. All of these are barriers to entry. So if you have figured out your infrastructure correctly, you can keep your competitors out. So you can occupy a very good place in the market because others will not want to come in with generic products. So you can have a whole portfolio that is actually more valuable than a comparable small molecule. So that's what I'm really looking for in the early stage investment, is how strategically are people thinking to protect their space. Because if we think about, say, Epidiolex, and you think about how they've set up the supply chain, growing a particular varietal in England, extracting it there, shipping it into United States, putting it in the marketplace, it's a difficult model to mimic without making a huge investment. And are you going to invest it for the sake of one drug? So who is going to challenge their dominance in the marketplace? So that's what I would look for in a company, is how well have they thought out how to keep the domination in the marketplace alive. So that's where I'll stop.
It seems like the fundamental question is how does one make investment decisions if there's no history? I think that's kind of, how do we assess risk given the lack of history? And I think the way you can do that is within the space, there's a deep history of psychedelic science. And one thing that we're doing within EI is we're merging so-called kitchen chemistry with state-of-the-art organic chemistry. When I say kitchen chemistry, I really mean individuals that have been working in the underground for decades now, advancing the field of psychedelic science so that they could really drive the conversation forward. And so what we now have at EI are a number of real, rare, authentic compounds that can be validated and streamlined through vertical integration, testing, clinical trials. And ultimately, the way you mitigate risk, I think, is having this deep well of psychedelic science, of kitchen chemistry, and combining it with cutting edge clinical trials today. And so I think, you know, when we look at the field, we have to really embrace the psychedelic community and the so-called psychedelic godfathers, because they've been working at this for years. We should not forget about these people. And while, of course, I think looking into R&D solutions for cutting edge things, it's in a way a shot in the dark when you neglect the decades of work that's already gone down in the underground.
Yeah.
Alex.
Can I just chime in with Alex? I agree with that, but the reason I'm a bit freakish about words is I want to win the argument.
Agreed.
If I carry a disadvantage by using words that was in a prior argument that was lost, I don't know that I'm giving myself all the advantages I want to. And so I spent a lot of time getting people to talk about milligrams rather than grams, and to talk about outcomes rather than ingredients of which strain they liked. And that helped convince 75-year-old women why they might be better to consider cannabinoids as an option for whatever ailed them specifically than the pharmaceutical products. And so there's a question on the side. I'm not sure the right answer on what we should be calling, but to me, it's some form of a neuromedicinal positioning. And the reason I do that is I understand fully that psychedelics is in fact probably the most correct word, but it also comes with a guitar track playing in the background.
Yeah.
And so to my first objective, which is to win the argument, I would prefer to figure out a way to get there without having to have people bring up long dead rock stars or other irrelevant discussion points. And so that's why I'm a little bit touchy on how do we win the argument with the FDA? How do we win the argument with NASDAQ? How do we win the argument with European specific country regulators? If we take a court of appeal approach and we want to have a charter right win depending on the country, what do we want the headline in the newspaper to say? Do we want to say Canada has now been forced under its charter rights and constitutional law to have a psychedelic party? Or do we want it to read something about the neuromedicinal benefits have been proven? And so that's kind of why I get a little weird about it.
You raise a good point that actually leads into another question that I wanted to ask all of you. Psychedelics are, forgive me, I forgot the phrase you just used. I'm going to use psychedelics for the balance of this. It is a correct word. It does carry a lot of baggage. Which leads to the question, as psychedelics are re-emerging after decade upon decade upon decade of the war on drugs, what are the biggest barriers to growth that you see for this industry? What would be the most important barriers to break through that would unleash the potential and see these incredibly valuable medicinal molecules broadly in people's hands? Bruce, you raised one, which is the stigma, which is the cultural element. Jay, Alex, you have comments on those or any other barriers you'd like to bring up?
I think the stigma is a very critical component. And I think as we develop the data and we are open about addressing the balance between the therapeutic benefits and acknowledging that there is a stigma and why we are still going forward because of the proven therapeutic benefits which we can demonstrate through clinical trials. I think making that argument will be appealing. The way I see it, there is no point in shying away from the stigma. It's there, but at the same time, presenting that, look, we have done the clinical trials. Here is the data. This is why the FDA has approved it. Making that argument will be persuasive. At least that's where I see it.
Yeah, I think so. The rise in interest in this field and popular culture from people who wouldn't be interested if it was approached from a social guitar youth angle is the general interest in the populace is there, and it's because of the mental illness approach, the impact that the studies from highly accredited institutions are having. Alex, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think when I'm looking at the barriers ahead, I really am focused on how do we build an industry that's founded upon integrity, and that's an industry that we can be proud of and really think about the broader impact here. And what I'm most concerned of is this notion of this ever-present, I don't know how to put it, inertia maybe that moves us towards the status quo. And based on that, I think we need to have, we need to prioritize a few things. We need to prioritize equitable and affordable access and not get carried away in terms of the tickets that are going to be attributed to these medicines. I think at the same time, we need to have a commitment to the plants themselves that are able to produce these amazing phenomena. And I think it's really important to try and stay plant-based or strive towards plant-based when possible. And I think at the same time, we need to have a framework really to working with communities and serving them towards achieving the first two goals. Because if we don't do all this, we're not going to be differentiated from the status quo. And the status quo right now is a status quo in which we're dealing with two national health epidemics, the opioid epidemic and obviously COVID with all its mental health issues that are going to come from that. And so I really think that we need to, as an industry, come together and strive towards higher standards. And I think that the status quo necessarily has a inertia to it that's going to prevent us from achieving things like equitable and affordable access.
I think that's bang on. One trick I would encourage everybody who's got one of these companies or is thinking of starting one doing is borrow other people's credibility.
Yeah.
And I say that I think I did that so extensively. It was almost like I stole other people's credibility in a sense in Canopy. But like the first marijuana company Deloitte ever audited was legally that they knew of was us. And so if you said, well, who's the auditor of pick a big pharma company? Could be Deloitte. And so if you're a little startup, even if it costs you 25% more, if you're a stupid little thing, but your auditor is one of the big ones, and you can actually say to your potential investors, your next round after you're after seed, we have very, You know, we have proper accounting. Everything's been done. We're ready to be SOX compliant. We have Deloitte as our auditor. It is bizarre, but if we can borrow as many relevant service provider references as we can, we start to actually fit into a box that is similar to the other companies, even though the undertakings we have is different. And I was always almost alarmed how effective that was with an investor. So I throw it out there. It's one of the things I like to see in companies is that they actually are trying to use leverage rather than just strength.
Definitely.
It's a microcosm, I think, of the industry in general. One of the biggest differences, I think, with cannabis is that psychedelics is driven by a mountain of well-executed clinical data. I think cannabis industry would be jealous of just the sheer volume of credible, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies that have happened in psychedelics. So the whole industry is leveraging credibility of places like Johns Hopkins and University of Leiden and NYU, then companies should do the same thing because this is legitimate. I think that's the, if I were to summarize your statement in 3 words, that's it. This is legitimate businesses leveraging incredibly powerful, legitimate molecules that legitimately do very good things for people who are suffering and very good things for people who are looking to increase their wellness. Any other thoughts on the barriers? We focused on the cultural one, which is underpinned by legitimacy. And Jay, I think you raised IP as an issue because none of these molecules in and of themselves are patentable. Alex, I know your company is looking at creating a patent portfolio around the combination of plant molecules. Could you comment on that for a moment? Some questions were coming up about what Orthoganol does. So could you focus on that piece of your business?
Sure. So when it comes to our patent work, it all relates to our proprietary formulations. We have a number of patent techniques. You know, at this point, no one can obviously patent the molecules themselves because they naturally exist in nature. And so, you know, what we're doing with EI is that we've developed and are patenting 3 transformative psychedelic medicines. We have a number of more compounds on the way. And the whole notion is really just trying to assemble the most compelling IP portfolio of psychedelic medicines. And it's based on the premises of striving to start with the whole plants themselves and integrating the kitchen chemistry and psychedelic godfathers that we work with in a more formalized, vertically integrated setting so that we can bring their cutting edge solutions to market. And so, of course, it's not about patenting the molecules, that's impossible, but it's a matter of patenting our proprietary formulations.
I see. Do you believe that, please go ahead, Jay.
I was just going to add that even beyond patents, there is also incredible value in databases, because we've been talking about wellness programs. And one thing we've seen, you know, you can't patent data banks, but that is of incredible value when you're treating patients. I mean, there are whole HIPAA and privacy concerns, and you know, that's, you'll have to hire a lawyer to advise you on that. But a failed trial has as much value as a successful trial, because you learn a lot from what went wrong. And these enormous data banks, they have incredible market value that's not going to be captured in a patent. So when we are talking about the IP value in the market, we are not just looking at patent portfolios. I just wanted to make that point, because when we're looking at the investments in a company and we're talking about its IP, to just talk about patents is perhaps a little misleading, because we are looking at the trade secrets, the databases, their platforms for gathering IP, which in and of itself is of value, plus their patent portfolio. Right. So it's a whole picture over here.
Good point. The data is crucial, particularly in these early days. When we were talking earlier about access, and I see some of the questions coming up and coming up from the audience speak to this as well. When we talk about access, and when you think in pharmaceutical terms, which this truly is not, it's a we all know it's much more than that. It's the therapeutics that are enabled by these molecules themselves. It's not simply the consumption. So accessibility isn't just about the cost of the administration of the molecules. It's also around the therapeutics, which can be quite expensive if you look at some of the studies that are taking place now. We're talking about multiple hours, with sitters and trained professionals and psychiatrists. Have you seen anything, what is compelling out there in terms of protocols? Are they patentable? Are they're certainly not going to be trade secrets once they're administered to the public, but is there any innovation you're seeing around protocols that would aid in accessibility? Clinical protocols.
That sounds like an awesome question for somebody who used to be a scientist who's now a lawyer.
Where can we get one of those?
I have to ask you to repeat the question. I missed it.
No problem. When we talk about accessibility, which I think is something that underpins every good actor in this space, is accessibility. We're not just talking about the cost of the drugs themselves.
Right.
We're also talking about the expense around the administration and the use of them, which can be very expensive, multiple hours with professionals. Is there any innovation around there that you've seen or you'd like to speak to?
I think this is something where I do not have an easy answer for you, but I think this is where a combination of telemedicine, telehealth, and drug administration, we'll be seeing a lot of interesting platforms emerge. And I think one of the things we've seen in the past few weeks is the emergence of telemedicine. And I do not know where this industry will go. I'm not a doctor. I cannot prescribe. I would never want to be in that position either. However, access is a very significant problem, how this will be covered by insurance, how HIPAA will come into play, how the privacy concerns will be addressed. And you have to remember, the pharmaceutical industry is not just limited to United States. This is a global issue. And a pharmaceutical company, for it to make profit, it doesn't just have to think about United States. It has to think about how it is going to sell this unitary issue, this combination, to the regulatory bodies across the world. So I think we are going to see some innovative combinations emerge, and where it will go, I do not know, but I can imagine that a combination of telehealth practices, remote access to practitioners, along with access to medication, may be the answer that will address the need for a patient to be in the same room as the physician, and that may address some of the accessibility and cost concerns. But I say that purely as a hypothesis and as a hypothetical, and I do not presume to be a soothsayer that can predict what will happen.
I just want to give a shout out.
All the disclaimers.
So there's a newsletter that I love called The Trip Report that's really helped me thinking about this. The writer's name is Zach Hagney. If you guys can subscribe to this, it's called The Trip Report. And what he talked about in one of his newsletters is really about how innovation and delivery with psychedelics are inherently coupled. And look, psychedelic medicine will be so unique because it's not a drug that's delivered at a pharmacy, but in conjunction with things like therapy, set and setting, and of course, implementing tools like biosensors for telemedicine are going to be really helpful. But what we need to find is innovation in treatments and pragmatic implementation to reach the millions who are suffering from the various indications that we're going after. And so I think telemedicine's awesome. We've been toying with some communal-oriented ideas at EI, figuring out how you could bring communities together and structure therapy sessions and psychedelic sessions so that they're more cost-effective. I think at the end of the day, it's really about figuring out, again, how to harness traditions, how to harness trade secrets, and implement them in a way that are as efficient but also respecting as possible.
Guys, I can confirm there are some serious investors on here, except they're also like 9-year-olds. They're heckling me over my look. But I can tell you that some of the people who are heckling me can write really big checks. So we should keep going on this. But hey, do you mind if I hit 3 things from the sidebar? Because I've been super good by my standard for the whole time. I've sat in my chair the whole time, and I have like actually shared the microphone. I wanted to hit
That needs to be rewarded. Hit away.
Yeah, then there's no one here to feed me a kibble. So I think there was one side comment. I would say that JR is definitely learning media training. And one of the things with media training is always make positive statements. And what I mean by that is there's a very good way to be opposed to something, which is to be in favor of something else. And so you might want to always explain, like, if you're in favor of really good regulation, you'd like to see a regulated market, and the benefit of a regulated market for research would be that if there are products that can be delivered in the context of a visit to a pharmacy or in the context of a physio session and or other professional sessions brought as a combo, that those can be then over time a regulated and insured outcome, which means that the benefactor of the outcome doesn't have to find a deep pocket to get it. And so make positive statements in regulated markets versus decriminalized may have a bigger path to that. You were asking about a barrier. One of the biggest barriers is going bankrupt. So companies that go bankrupt almost always have less cash than they wanted. And so regrettably, what has to happen is we have to have some people who find money and progress. But I would ask that, and I like the fact that Christian put some money in. Now I got to put some money into MAPS too. And I have no opposition to it. I'm in favor of everybody getting stuff done. But you should press all of the companies to at least have sort of a 3-legged stool. They should have things they wish to protect. They should have things that they wish to share in a common scientific good. And they should have an ability to share with others who are all profit driven, but not big pharma. And so they should have a way that they partner, and it could be their supply chain for the ingredients as someone described, but there should be a collaboration, because the competition is no one that you've described on this call today. The competition is the existence of bad practices and suspect channels. So I would go there. And maybe the biggest surprise I had in this space, there's a zillion times more and better research, which I knew existed, but I didn't know the depth and quality in this space than there ever was for anything to do with cannabinoids. Like serious academic work in all kinds of geographies waiting to come out of the dark and be turned into successful outcomes. And so someone had made some comments on that on the sidebar. Fundamental advantage, but again, that means access to researchers by ethical folks who aren't going to just jam them. And what I saw in the cannabis space was a number of very good researchers who met people who talked about money and then kept all the money and made the researcher stuck as a founder. And so one final thing I saw on the side is, how do we make sure the founders stay? Sometimes you don't want them to, right? Like having a good idea does not mean you have good capacity to continue it on. And they shouldn't be gone in the first year. But I've seen around other sectors, including this one, sometimes there are good people initiating things, and after a year and a half, it'd be better if they weren't there. And I'm not talking about any of the companies I'm involved with, but it's not the end of a company when you blow people up.
Yeah, revolutionaries don't always make the best stable leaders after the revolution is over.
But I agree with the comment. Founders should not be able to cash out. These companies should have, if a founder has more than 15% of the stock, they should have a structure in their ownership that tranches it out over like 3 years plus. And that becomes a listing requirement in many jurisdictions. And if you're going to be an investor, I would be quite clear that I'm willing to be an investor, an employer, a supporter, but I want to see that you have effectively a vesting schedule, that your liquidity can't happen rapidly. And they're fools if they want it to happen rapidly, so have bad alignment right away.
I have to ask one more question before I turn to the others, Bruce, and this is coming up all over the place. Your hat, is High a brand, or do you just dig that?
It's totally true story. So the way we did 16 financings in the creation of Canopy and 31 acquisitions, and I would take these, here I am crossing the border from Canada to the US, and I have those bags that inside it you have a pop-up banner. And on the top of my banner would say, hi, H-I, I'm from Tweed. And then it had some picture of plants because that was required. And it would say, we're your first best choice for marijuana, whatever. And I'd pop that up at events. And suppose you came by and said, why does it say hi on your poster? My gut reaction would be keep moving along. You have no clue you're not seeing the double meaning here. If you came by and said, that's hilarious, you're a marijuana company, I'd say sit down, because I felt it was like at least a 50-50 chance you might invest because you could see where it was going. And so it's with everything. Like the reason I called it Tweed was Tweed could be a nice fabric or a not nice fabric, depending on your taste, but it could also be therapeutic weed. And I like to have everything where you had to think about it, because the whole goal in everything should be you shouldn't be able to tell someone the outcome that you want them to adopt. You should be able to find people who will think. And if you find people who think, they will actually make the outcome you seek better. And so I always like to have things that attract thinkers, people who kind of get the angle and then want to take it further.
I think this entire sector, one of the things that I find attractive about it is it's a self-selecting group of people who feel something, which leads me to the next question, which is, it came up in our first webinar in a wonderful exchange between Rick Doblin and Christian Angermeyer. It's come up on conversations I've been having online. And that is the place of capitalism and altruism in psychedelics. You know, I use the toss-off phrase. It sounds toss-off, but I think it's actually a mission to do well and to do good at the same time. North Star just came out with the code of ethics in psychedelics. How should companies behave, and what are the best kinds of investments that you look for to achieve both a financial ROI and a social ROI? How can well-placed investments advance the social good that psychedelics can achieve? Let me start this one with you, Jay.
I am an IP lawyer mainly. So what can I say is that when you're developing when you're developing your products, when you're developing your portfolio, consider sharing.
Yeah.
That is what I would say is about social good, because one of the biggest barriers for others entering the same marketplace is lack of sharing.
Definitely.
So be generous. When you're doing good, be generous. But at the same time, you have your investors to protect, and they will want you not to share sometimes. And how you make that balance is how you balance doing well and being good.
Definitely. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I love that quote from Huxley, where it's like the only corner of the universe you can actually be confident in improving is your own. And I think in this space, we're going to see cooperative models. We need to ensure that the companies that we believe in have the right capital stack. And I think at this point, you know, we really are putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to equity, access. You know, when you look at our business model, you can see that in our commitments, but we're really anchoring that with the notion of a foundation. So we're establishing an EI foundation to safeguard and serve and also really uplift the point of view that we're trying to put forward, which prioritizes access and which is focused on the plants themselves. And I think that the only way that we can really ensure our larger goals is by having that kind of focus with the foundation. And I think that I encourage all companies to kind of hold themselves accountable through similar measures. And through those measures, then we can unify with groups like the North Star, and unify over pledges so that we can actually ensure that, yeah, investors aren't taking money off the table prematurely. Yeah, we are trying to make this as affordable and accessible as possible. Otherwise, you know, I unfortunately think that there will be that pull to the status quo that I was referring to, you know, earlier in the talk.
The status quo you're referring to is the opportunism and sorry,
Yeah.
Bruce, go ahead. I saw you physically raising your hand. Go ahead.
Well, I think we have only 5 minutes. One of the things, some of the sidebar questions, one of the questions I'd ask if you're an investor is does the company provide option access to 100% of the people who work there? And is it reasonably balanced? Meaning, not that if the founder has stock, they shouldn't be taking much options and none in the early stages, maybe get awards later, 2-3 years in. But ask if they share that 10% pool and what their plan is and how they do it. Because if they're really bad at sharing and being reasonable and considerate with the people who are creating all the value, imagine how they're going to screw everybody else that's supposed to be getting some kind of social good out of psychedelics. I think that is, if you're greedy, you're greedy, you're greedy. And if you have to pick one of the worst of the 7 to see, to me, I've seen greed in the last 6 years, and greed says, at the end of the day, I made more money and there's no justification necessary. It's just a good day because of that. That means they can basically steal from anyone, mistreat anyone, and they will. And so I think somebody named David has been putting that how you behave anytime is the way you behave all the time. And so I would ask, do you have an equity options access program, and how does it operate, and dig in on that a lot?
We do. I can attest to that. David's the founder of Orthoganol, and we certainly have that program.
Okay. And I had no idea of the connection, but I think those are indicative signs of someone thinking that they want to be successful over the next 3 to 5 years.
Definitely.
It connects to what you said earlier, that we're ultimately at the end of the day, as much as you're investing in a good idea, you're investing in the human beings that are behind it. And there are signs in how they behave and how they structure their companies. And I have to say,
what hotel do they stay at? If you're a startup and you're staying at the Four Seasons, get with it.
Yeah, it's not going to work. No $1,000 alcohol tabs. It's not going to work.
Not from us. Everybody on the panel, I want to say thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time and, more importantly, with your thoughts. I also want to thank the PsyTech team that pulled this together. I want to thank our sponsors, and I want to give a special thanks to our partners at ICANN, at Israel Cannabis. Look for the recording of this, all of our webinars and interviews on www.psytech.biz. You can look for it in the sidebar here. And again, please join us for the PsyTech Virtual Summit in late May. Just go to psytech.biz, click events, and register for that. That will also be free for all attendees. We're trying to build the community that's going to drive the innovation in this sector. So with that, I'll say thank you once again, and stay well, everybody.
And my email's in the side chat. If that, I see David's jamming it, but mine's in there too if people want to reach out.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
This was awesome.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Take care.